Hello everybody and welcome to today's episode of the Activist Lawyer podcast. Today I am joined by Miranda Cleland, who is an advocacy officer at the Defence for Children International Palestine and lives in Washington, DC, where she leads the No Way to Treat a Child campaign and advocates for the human rights of Palestinian children. Miranda's a writer, speaker, facilitator and campaigner with expertise in children's rights, the Israeli military detention system, and Israeli military killings of Palestinian children. She holds a bachelor's with honours from American University in International Studies and Arabic language, and has taken additional coursework in international law and the protection of children in armed conflict. So I am particularly delighted to welcome Miranda to talk with me about her work. We already had one of her colleagues on before. From the Defence for Children International Palestine, the director, of course, Khaled Guzmar. And we're familiar with their work. They have been relentless in terms of documenting the horrific violations of children's rights and the numbers of deaths that are occurring not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank and across the occupied territories, which are often so forgotten about as we focus on what's happening in Gaza. So I hope you enjoy today's podcast. We are bringing you, obviously, trying to track the legal developments around what's happening. We have been doing it from the very outset. So we have more guests to come over the next few months. And yes, so please like and review and subscribe and share with your friends if you're enjoying the episodes. Thank you again. So Miranda, thank you for joining me today. I know you're joining me from Washington, DC. Good to have you.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for inviting me to join.
Not at all. Well, look, I might just start with your role and the organisation itself, Defence for Children International Palestine, who are no strangers to the podcast. And I think at this kind of important juncture in what's happening, we have been charting some of the developments, particularly the legal developments around what's happening in Palestine. We're going on 10 months of this particular genocide. And I'm familiar with some of the work that your organisation has been doing. But firstly, just about you and your role as an advocacy officer with Defence for Children International Palestine.
Yeah, so Defence for Children International Palestine is the only local human rights organization in Palestine that's focused on the rights of children. So we cover children's rights violations in the occupied Palestinian territory, which is the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, as well as the Gaza Strip. We were initially founded to provide legal aid to children who are detained, arrested, and prosecuted by the Israeli military, and have since evolved into a full-fledged human rights organization with one of our main focuses is documenting human rights violations of children with a particular eye to child fatalities, injuries, and detention-related issues. So we have field researchers in all throughout the occupied Palestinian territory, including several who are in Gaza now. And in my position as an advocacy officer, it's my responsibility alongside my team to take the documentation that the field researchers are collecting, the evidence that they are seeing, and turning that into materials for the public, using those materials to advocate for greater protections for children on the international and the national levels. And yeah, really to just make sure that these children's experiences aren't just numbers and they aren't just statistics, that the full experiences of these children are used to seek justice.
Brilliant. Fantastic work. And I know we did mention, I think on one or two of our podcasts when we were talking about the legal actions that were being taken around the world. Obviously, we're familiar with what's happening in the ICJ and also the ICC. But there was another case that maybe you are probably best in terms of explaining, which is an action that was taken against Biden and a number of other representatives on the US administration in the context of, I think it was the Centre for Constitutional Rights and your organisation as well. Now, I know the outcome might not have been exactly what was anticipated, but I still think it was a very valid and relevant case. Can you maybe explain a little bit about how the case came about and the significance of it?
Yeah, absolutely. So back in November, it was just 1 or 2 weeks into November 2023, the Center for Constitutional Rights filed a lawsuit. It was a case brought by Palestinian human rights organizations, including DCI-P, a number of Palestinian Americans with family in Gaza, as well as Palestinians in Gaza themselves. And this case was brought against President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, and Secretary of Defense Austin for their role in the genocide of Palestinians. The Biden administration has repeatedly fast-tracked military assistance and weapon sales to Israel, which is very clearly aiding and abetting the genocide. Mm-hmm. The first hearing for the case was in January, and I often still think back to that first hearing, which was almost 5 hours long, of testimony, one right after another. Hour after hour of testimony from Palestinians describing in really excruciating detail how U.S. weapons had killed, injured, and forcibly displaced their loved ones in Gaza. Mm-hmm. The district court in California ended up dismissing the case, and we appealed, and the appellate court, which we just heard back from recently, ultimately upheld the dismissal of the case on the basis of the political question doctrine, that the judicial branch in the U.S. does not have oversight into foreign policy, which is the responsibility of the executive branch. Okay. So the court essentially rules that the president of the United States can do whatever he wants, as long as it's in the realm of foreign policy. Turns out, even help commit a genocide. And the courts can do nothing about it. So this is a very dangerous and scary prospect, because if the courts cannot stop the Biden administration from funding the Israeli military's campaign of genocide, then who can? Yeah,
exactly. My goodness. But I guess the case received worldwide attention, and I suppose it was a good opportunity to raise the issues, that we shouldn't need to say that or do that at this stage, but clearly we do. So even in terms of highlighting the judicial process and all failures that perhaps exist, I mean, these are small steps and they do nothing to stop what's happening on the ground, but it really is in terms of making progress in terms of the legal way forward. I guess it was, a good case to bring and to have that testimony raised as well from the Palestinian families that have been suffering. But so US administration, I mean, it's steadfast in its support for Israel. This word ironclad is constantly used. And I think we're no further on from that, I would say, in terms of, vocal and verbal support, as well as funding the military efforts of Israel. But there's, of course, a stark difference when it comes to the US support for international law, decisions and mechanisms. When we look at what's happening with Ukraine, for example, and other crises around the world and their response to it. Why do you think, living there and being there on the ground, they're so reluctant to uphold and administer international law when it comes to holding Israel to account for war crimes and breaches of international law? And what does this mean for democracy and the rule of law?
Yeah.
It's a big one, but
I mean, Israel has, for a very long time enjoyed quite an exceptional relationship with the United States, where Israeli leaders and their soldiers have been allowed to do whatever they want with absolutely no accountability or recourse. Part of our work at DCI Palestine is documenting when Palestinian children are killed by Israeli soldiers, which, obviously has reached an unprecedented scale in Gaza since October. But, we've been documenting these numbers for more than 20 years. Yeah. Like, the Israeli forces have pretty systematically targeted Palestinian children with live ammunition, with deadly force, for a very long time. And it's a very established pattern. And Palestinian human rights organizations have really professionalized the world of documenting these rights violations because they've been living under occupation for so long. So the U.S. has treated Israel with this degree of exceptionality for basically since the inception of the state of Israel, and Palestinians have been diligently reporting on rights violations pretty much ever since. Yeah. Now today that this genocide in Gaza is being live streamed on Instagram, on social media, people can see for themselves.
Yeah.
The rotten core of Israel's aim to wipe out Palestinians. And then they see their elected officials, they see the U.S. president, sort of repeatedly say that, the United States supports Israel. There are no red lines. Our support is ironclad for the state of Israel. So people can see these for themselves. They don't, you can open your phone and you can see what's happening in Gaza without
in real time,
going to sort of any legacy news. You don't need anybody to explain it to you. You can see it for yourself. So I think that the dissonance is very clear for just everyday people. The difference between what is happening and what their leaders are supporting. And if international law was held up and equally applied to all, U.S. presidents and elected officials would be found guilty in The Hague alongside Netanyahu and his Israeli co-conspirators. But it's very clear that the U.S. and Israeli leaders alike see themselves as immune to international legal consequences, which, that's been their reality so far. We believe these systems should treat perpetrators equally and hold everybody accountable to the same standards.
Yeah, I mean, the double standards are absolutely surreal. And that makes it all the more mind-boggling in terms of we don't need to look for evidence. There's more than enough evidence there. This is going on for 10 months. And people are still disputing numbers or using phrases like civilians are being protected. And we're seeing that this is absolutely so far from the case. And of course, what you're dealing with, and as you rightly point out, your organisation for decades has been looking at children in particular, and not just recounting these children as numbers, as stats, as statistics, but children who have had hopes and dreams and who are either extremely injured that they'll never be the same again, have lost family members, or in fact have been victims and murdered throughout this genocide. So it's really, I don't think I'll ever understand what is happening at the minute in terms of responses around the world. Now, as we sit on and look here from Ireland and what's happening in the US with the election and everything coming up, I mean, we're also looking at the findings in terms of the ICJ recently around the occupied territories, which was historic. Wasn't very widely reported here, Miranda, so I'm not sure if it was reported on the media in America. We saw very little of that significant judgment, which was quite damning. And then, of course, we have the plausible genocide finding and the advisory opinion declaring Israel to be effectively an apartheid state. We've the issue of the arrest warrants as well with the ICC. I suppose my question is, not knowing exactly how things stand in America, do you feel the tide will turn? I mean, it's worrying as we see Netanyahu there and the support that he's received over the last number of days in America. But is there any sense of people, maybe turning and realising, look, these world courts are finding that this is apartheid, this is wrong, and we have to do something about that? Or is it going to remain the same?
I think the tide has already turned in the States. In terms of the people, I think back to doing this job and doing this work sort of prior to October last year. And, when you meet someone or you say what you do for work, I usually would have to explain quite a bit of context in terms of my role and what DCI-P does. But now it seems like the public literacy and understanding of, the issues faced by Palestinian people and Israel's campaign of genocide is quite high. I think many people really understand quite quickly what's going on. And I think that's because they can see it for themselves. Yeah. And I think this really exposes the the disconnect between the people of the United States and the politicians, as alongside the interests of weapons manufacturers who profit from genocide.
Absolutely. Well, look, I just mentioned the man himself, Netanyahu, and we're aware that he was in Washington. I couldn't believe that the event actually took place. I find it very difficult to understand. But what does it mean, I suppose, in terms of your work for Palestinian children and their families, for Netanyahu to take centre stage at this time with his address to Congress?
Yeah. I mean, just living here in Washington, D.C., it was kind of astounding to see the amount of, I'll call it security theater that was set up in terms of his visit. All of the roads were closed off surrounding the hotel he was staying in. All the roads were closed off around the Capitol building. Additional police officers were bussed in from New York City, which is, 4.5 hours away. This is the city and the government of DC really put on a show.
Yeah.
In terms of the amount of security that was set up ahead of this visit. I did spend an unfortunate hour listening to Netanyahu's address to Congress, and there were a few things I think that stuck out to me. I don't think that he in particular said anything particularly interesting or unexpected. The way he talks and the way he expresses his views about Palestinians is, I think, pretty consistent with how he has been doing this for a long time. And what I found really kind of just shocking to watch play out in real time was, the room of members of Congress. And I will say that, not every single member of Congress attended.
Yeah.
Actually, about half of Democrats were not there, whether they were officially boycotting the speech, which is not to say they are particularly pro-Palestinian, but I think they consider themselves anti-Netanyahu, which are very different things.
Yeah, very different.
But, pretty much every other sentence that he said on the podium, the whole room stood up and started clapping and whooping and cheering for him. And I did find it surreal to sort of watch that play out over the course of the hour. Particularly because just about everything he said was not true. I mean, he really was spewing lie after lie for the entire address.
And they were already dispelled, those lies.
I think I could go on and on and on about that for the rest of the day, probably. But the one piece that I want to talk about, just because it was very fresh in my mind from what I had been working on this week. One of the first things he said was, saying that Palestinians are lying about the starvation crisis in Gaza, and that Israel has actually allowed so much humanitarian aid and an unprecedented amount of aid and all of these things. And, I did the math, actually. He said, like, how many pounds of aid that Israel has facilitated. And he said, that comes out to 3,000 calories for every man, woman, and child in Gaza. It's been almost 10 months. I did the math. That's 10 calories a person a day. And that's nothing. So the reason this was so fresh in my mind and why I found it so particularly enraging was we had DCI Palestine has a field researcher in the northern part of Gaza, which is experiencing a devastating famine and has been for months. And there's nothing to eat. There is hardly any medicine. There is no baby formula. I had just finished editing a report where the field researchers interviewed 7 or 8 families who had all lost children to starvation. And it was, testimony after testimony after testimony. And all of these children were very young. Many of them were babies. The story that you read some of these things, and I think some of these stories I'll just never forget, because it was such a visceral experience, working on this case. And it was so difficult to even read the words of parents talking about their, the 3-month-old baby Anwar, who was born in North Gaza to a malnourished mother. And, that's something we've seen a lot of, is that babies are born to pregnant mothers who did not have enough to eat. And if you don't have enough to eat, then your baby is pretty much born malnourished right away. And if you don't have enough to eat, then you're not able to produce breast milk. And if you're not able to produce breast milk, then your baby will die because there's no formula. And so, I was just working on this testimony from Anwar's mother, who said, he was crying of hunger all night, and then his temperature rose and he had seizures, and then he died, and that was it. So for Netanyahu to stand on, this stage addressing the United States Congress and to accuse Palestinians of making it up or lying or stealing the aid or anything, it's like, it's not true. And we have the evidence to back it up. It's, I'm not just saying this because I'm upset with him. It factually is not true. Like I opened this report from the field researchers thinking we were going to have 1 or 2 cases, but it just kept going. There were, 7 or 8 families that provided testimony for this. And it was just, it's, I keep thinking we have sort of reached the depths of, the worst that humanity has to offer. But babies crying themselves to sleep of hunger and then not waking up is just, some of the most horrifying things.
It's absolutely horrifying. Yeah. And I mean, we're the same. You keep thinking you've reached a point where it couldn't get any worse. And then, of course, you wake up the next day and you hear another horrific incident has happened. And I know your organization has been charting events for years, as I said. And when Khaled, the director of DCI Palestine, was on our podcast, he discussed, deplorable and innumerable. He couldn't even put a figure on it because the reports were coming in so thick and fast to the organisation that they could not keep up. And that's in terms of not only the deaths that had been occurring, but also the severe violations of children's rights, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank and across the occupied territories. So at 10 months in now, I imagine, and I often think about him and I think about your organisation, that was a number of months ago now, and things were horrific and really bad. What are you and your team facing now at this stage? You've just given some evidence there and some of testimony around young children and young babies and mothers that is quite shocking. But how does the organisation respond to the severe number of incidents that are being recorded?
Yeah. It's been interesting to reflect on the last 10 months just in terms of our work, because while Israel's campaign of genocide now in Gaza is in many ways very consistent with its treatment of Palestinians for the bulk of the last century, and is certainly consistent with cases that we've documented in the West Bank. But the scale and the speed of this genocide is really staggering and truly shocking. And, it's hard to, I guess 10 months ago when everything started, I was thinking back to really the start of COVID here in the United States, where, it was the middle of March 2020, and they told everybody to go work from home. And I kind of looked at my roommate at the time, and I was like, we were like, how long do you think this will last? Like a couple weeks? And, I look back to October 2023, and it's the same thing. It's like I remember when it started, and we all kind of looked at each other as well, how long could this possibly last? How bad could it possibly be? And I don't know if anybody had, in their worst imaginations thought that we would get to the point of, babies dying of starvation due to Israeli policies. Right now we're working on, as I mentioned, we have field researchers throughout Gaza and the West Bank doing really heroic work, documenting cases of child rights violations. They're really focused on the starvation issue, documenting wounded children with no surviving family and children who are unaccompanied. There are children with extremely devastating injuries who have either suffered injuries from Israeli bullets or shrapnel from airstrikes or other types of injuries that, if many of them are the types of injuries that if, Israeli authorities and Israeli forces, if they had not worked so hard to collapse Gaza's healthcare system, like many of these children would still be able to walk.
Yeah.
But, an injury now in Gaza is, there's very little support for anybody who has a serious injury, and whether they need a surgery, a prosthetic, physical therapy, any kind of follow-up care, pain medication, it doesn't exist. So, we're seeing a lot of, there's a lot to say about disabled Palestinian children and the kind of the world that they will grow up in.
Yeah.
One, I guess, final thing I'd like to highlight in terms of what we've been working on is, I've mentioned briefly a few times the West Bank, and the West Bank is still in an area where our field researchers are able to document every child fatality at the hands of Israeli forces and settlers, compared to Gaza, where the scale is just so vast that we're only able to document pieces and individual cases, whereas in the West Bank, we actually do have a better idea of the full picture. And I think UNICEF had actually done this math, and it's like, Israeli forces have killed a child in the West Bank every 2 days since October 7th. And we're seeing Israeli forces use aerial attacks in the West Bank for the first time since the Second Intifada in the early 2000s. And, these are children who almost all of them are shot in the head or shot in the chest. These are areas where if you shoot anybody from any distance, like, they are going to die, because these are shots to kill. And so we're working on a report currently that we're hoping to have out in the next month or two, about this, policy of shooting to kill children in the occupied West Bank, because the scale of child killings in the West Bank is, also truly shocking in many ways. And again, it is consistent, certainly, with how Israeli forces have treated Palestinian children for the last several decades and shown complete contempt for their lives. But the scale of it and the speed has really escalated since October. And, this is another issue where we want to ensure that these children's experiences are used to push for accountability and to push for justice, and that someone is held accountable for shooting them and killing them.
And of course, the fact that to date they haven't even been properly investigated by the ICC is beyond understanding. But at least organisations like yourself are able to document those cases, which, can you imagine, because of what's happening in Gaza, the number of children being shot at shoot to kill with their shoot to kill policy in the West Bank has increased, because it's almost like the eyes are focused on what's happening here and they're getting away with it. So it is truly, truly deplorable. And I don't envy, your field researchers as well. They must be reporting back on horrific first-hand accounts, and what they witness must be just absolutely unbearable. But it's necessary work, and thank goodness for organisations like yourself who are able to bring that evidence to the fore, which we hope will be used and will make this stop, because that's what needs to happen sooner rather than later. But Miranda, just in terms of your work and the organisation, for any of our listeners and for ourselves, I mean, what can we do to help? Even I'm thinking about as individuals, but also as the legal community. I mean, is there a way that we can step up and do more?
Yeah. So on, the individual level, I think, organizing wherever you can, wherever you are in your community, to push to hold your elected officials accountable, whether that's on the city level or the national level. Many of us live in countries and in places where elected officials have, talk about ironclad support for the state of Israel. And I think organizing where you can is very important. We are able to accept donations from individuals at our website, DCI-Palestine.org. And then as far as the legal community, I was recently at the Netherlands and had the opportunity to meet with the Rights Forum, just off the heels of their case against the Dutch government, providing spare parts for F-16 fighter jets to the Israeli military. And I really think these types of legal cases focused on weapons sales, focused on pushing for an arms embargo, I think are really important. And I have a lot of admiration for the Rights Forum and the work that they are doing in that particular context, because it is quite different than my context in the United States, where most of the weapons and the planes are actually manufactured. But, the Rights Forum, they picked this case, and it's, they found the company that was just providing spare parts, and I think it, it's pretty easy to argue, like, who cares about spare parts? Like, it's not the bombs, it's not the missiles, it's not the bullets. But I think it is good to call out, all these seemingly small ways and small things that contribute to the Israeli military's campaign to, carry out genocide against Palestinians, that, even the spare parts count. Even, the GPS systems used by the missile, all these things, whether it is the actual bomb or, a seatbelt for the plane. Like, these are all things that actually, make companies and governments and countries complicit in the genocide by continuing to provide this type of support for the Israeli government. And I really admire, I've been thinking a lot about this particular legal action, but I think this type of work, which works to really further financially and diplomatically isolate Israel, is really important, because, even if it's just spare parts, I think it's good for the public to understand that that's where those spare parts are going. And, that, this too makes, the government and the companies complicit in the genocide. And the last thing I'll say, I think, part of what Netanyahu talked about during his address to Congress was his, so-called day after plan for Gaza. And I think, every day, we are really hoping that there is a ceasefire deal soon, and that the bombs and the bullets will stop, because obviously that is the first thing that needs to happen, as soon as possible in order to save lives. Yeah. And I think what is so important for all of us to remember regarding any sort of conversation about, the day after plan for Gaza is to support Palestinian self-determination and, support the Palestinian people's rights to decide their own future, to decide what their government would look like, to decide what their state could look like, all of these things. It is not the responsibility of Israel or the United States or the European Union or any other country or international body to tell Palestinians how to run their society. So I think that is just an important thing to sort of keep in mind as some of these day after conversations come up soon.
It is, Miranda. I mean, that's just a vital message to get out there. Thank you so much, Miranda Cleland, for joining me today. It's been a pleasure to speak with you. I've been following your work and some of your articles as well, so fantastically written on this matter. And I really hope that your work continues and that you get the support you and your colleagues need to continue this work, because there's a long journey ahead, I would imagine, as we think about the children of Palestine and what they and their families are going through. So keep in touch and best of luck with everything.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
Thanks everyone for joining me today. If you like the show, please remember to share and leave a review if you have a moment. And you can also check out our website, www.activistlawyer.com, where you will see some blog articles written by our guests and contributors, as well as some fabulous Activist Lawyer merchandise.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service, where our team using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.